All right, so we're going to take a look at the CADAC CDC6 console. This is on loan from CADAC for us as we shop for a new console. This is the CDC6. They also have a CDC7, which is actually the one we would be looking at. It has this whole section and screen duplicated again on the right side of the master section. So it's a physically significantly larger console. It gives you a total of 32 channel faders all on one surface, which I absolutely love because I like lots of buttons and knobs. So we're going to go ahead and boot this thing up, take a look at what that looks like. I've got a laptop sitting up here. It's kind of hiding the power button. So there's a power button here. I get some power supply, status lights, and then when I hit power, it's going to start booting up. So as this boots up, you'll see that it's actually running an embedded version of Windows 7. Frankly, that's a little scary to me because that's been discontinued for quite a while, and it makes me wonder about the future of the platform. At some point, they will have to move away from Windows 7. It also, as we go through what the navigation and stuff of the Surface looks like, it also imposes some limitations. Obviously, Windows 7 was not designed and intended for touch screen interfaces, so we don't have things like velocity when we scroll across things. When you take your finger off, it stops. Some things like that. So I'm really hoping they can figure out how to move this thing over to Windows 10 so that we get some more touch-friendly interface actions. Currently there's no multi-touch or anything like that because, again, Windows 7 didn't support those things. So as this boots up, you'll see several options that go through here. We are running what is currently the current version of the firmware. We are on version 4.13. That's one thing that we'll talk about as we kind of go through the interface and poke around and play with it. I found quite a few bugs in the software, and several of them have been the kind that would interrupt a show. So it really gives me a lot of pause as we play with this. Here's a for instance. Do we want to reload snapshot? A settings snapshot from 12/7/2017 at 2:41 was found. Do you want to load it? I've not found a way to set the clock on this thing, so I was not up here playing with this at 2:41 a.m., but I've not found a way to set the clock. So one thing that really is odd to me is there's a dialogue asking me if I want to recall that particular snapshot. This is the only place I've been able to find in the entire console that it uses the word snapshot. So I don't know what that means. I believe that it's just saying, do you want to restore what you had the last time you shut the board down? But again, I don't have any confirmation of that. So I'm going to hit yes. That's what I've been hitting. So as we load up, I have pre-built a template basically for our engaged services, our contemporary services. This is not where this console, if we were to purchase this, this is not where it would get installed. It would get installed in our main sanctuary down at front of house. This is over here in our smaller engage, our contemporary worship space, because it's just a whole lot easier to swap a console in and out over here because I've got a 32 channel analog snake going in and out the back of my main board that usually lives here. It's just easy to unplug that, plug it straight into the stage box for the demo consoles that we're bringing in, and just run our contemporary services from that. Far less disruptive to our main services, so that's why this is over here. So what we've got set up is presets, mic naming, busing, all of that stuff for what we would normally do for our smaller contemporary services. So I'll kind of walk through the Surface itself and show what's what here. Obviously what we have is a nice big 24-inch touch screen. I do like the giant screen. I have some comments and thoughts on the actual interface itself. I'll come back around to those later. You do get 12 rotary encoders down the right side. I do like the way they feel. They are damped very nicely. There is a click function, so when you click down, press down on it, you do get a click. That is used in some settings. Across the bottom we have 16 of the same rotary encoders, same click function on those as well. We have a select button underneath each of the encoders. At the far left side we've got a swap button. I'll show what that does later. Copy and ISO buttons. And then we have our 16 channel faders. We've got little, I don't know what they call them, but I'm going to call them scribble strips. I've seen that name used a lot. Little displays here that show me the channel name, and optionally through the settings you can turn on the dB reading of the fader. So minus infinity all the way up to, oh, that's interesting, plus 9.4. So otherwise, these aren't used for anything else. There's probably a full 50% of the display across the middle that doesn't get used for anything. It seems like we could find something else to put there. So next down, we've got a solo button. I like the solos. I like how the solo function works on the console. And then we've got an on-off. Likewise, I do like, this is just strictly a personal preference, but I do like buttons that function in this way, meaning we've got a button that is not lit when the channel is off. When I light the button up, it says on, and the channel now is on. Some manufacturers use the opposite. In this state, the channel is on and passing audio, and the button is a mute button. So when you press it, it lights up and mutes the channel. That seems totally backwards to me. I like having an indicator that the channel is on and functioning. So I do like that. We do have meters alongside each of the faders. I do like that. It's different, so I'm getting used to it, but I think I like it. These are stereo left-right meters, so if you are passing a stereo signal into a pair of channels and then collapse those two channels down onto a single fader, you do get both left and right, or channels 1 and 2 meters on a single fader. So that's a kind of nice feature. I do like that. The faders themselves, they feel a little cheap, frankly. Just plastic caps on them. They're not super smooth. The rep did express to me that this is a kind of a first-gen console. It's been shipped all over the country. It's been at a bunch of trade shows and stuff. So we'll give them a little slack for that. But on the flip side, whatever we purchase is probably going to be a 10-year purchase. So I don't know how many years I'm going to have this thing in use at front of house before it starts to feel this same way. So just because it's been used a lot, I don't think it should necessarily start to feel kind of gritty and stuff like some of these faders do. So over here on the right side of the console, we do have the main settings screen. So this is how we configure the console. I do like that this is kind of off to the side, so it's not covering up my main interface where I get to see levels on the input channels and buses and EQ and compressors and stuff. So I do like having that kind of cordoned off to the side. It does let me interact with that without interfering over here. So we've got projects, which is where we can recall entire shows, or I guess the best way to think of these shows are as just folders of what, because we're British here, what they call cues or scenes. So that's basically all I've been able to find that this really does, is it's just a folder full of scenes. In the scenes or in the cue list, you can configure inputs, outputs, channel naming. Basically, as best I can tell, every function of the console is included in a cue when you save it. So I do like that, but it, I don't know, there's no input routing that I can save outside of a cue list, like a physical patch would be. So, and there's stuff here that I'm not quite sure what it does. I did download the manual from the website. It's a 50-page manual that basically has, you know, little arrows that point at things and say, this is a select button, this is a layer button. So the manual, I'm assuming there's got to be another manual that I'm not finding, because there's lots of stuff on the console that I don't know what it does, and things I can't figure out. So anyway, so that's how you get into projects. That's basically folders of cues. Other things you get to do through here, you hit the config menu, you can configure your input channels. I do really like this interface. This is something that I have not seen anybody else implement in quite this same way. We'll come back and look at that again in a minute, but my output buses are configured in much the same way. My solos, I do get a full menu for how to configure the solos. A few things feel a little, I don't know, rudimentary. There's only a single solo bus, so not a big deal, but just something to point out compared to another console or two that we're looking at. So we do configure our solos there. The back button, it feels odd that there's not a back button on this interface. It's a hardware button above the screen. TalkBack, I haven't played with the TalkBack section, but we will use the TalkBack once we get a final install put together. Settings, I do get some system settings. I don't know what these do, other than just poking around in them. Again, the user's manual doesn't say what any of these functions are. The bridge has something to do with network. There is an iPad app for the console, but I've not been able to get it to connect to the console, so I need some help there. Maintenance will let me obviously do nothing. There's nothing on that screen at all. So again, just a little odd. I do have brightness controls for all of the consoles, so I get a screen brightness. You can see that going up and down there. The surface are the hardware buttons themselves. That's the brightness of those, and then the meters as well have a separate brightness level. And then those all feed into a master, so I can bring the entire master up and down. So I do like the way that works. Something to point out though is when you bring the brightness of the screen all the way up, or I would say 2/3 of the way up, there are several interface elements on the main screen over here that just get washed out like crazy. So the channel names are white against a kind of a medium gray background, and when you bring the screen brightness all the way up, the channel names are white against a very, very light gray background. So that took us a while to figure out that we need to turn that down so we can actually read some of the labels. Other places where that shows up is if you go into some of these like busing or EQ or compression settings windows, you get yellow text on top of a kind of a light brown background. When the screen brightness is all the way up, those almost disappear completely. So if you were doing something where you had the console outside and you needed the screen brightness up pretty high, just something to be aware of. We don't have enough contrast on some of the user interface elements. So there's that. So back, again, we have a few more settings in here, but where all the meat is under the user options. So under user options, I have some settings that I can assign. Again, there are some buttons in here that I've not figured out what they do, and they are not listed in the owner's manual. A couple of little things. Honestly, there's not a whole lot in here that I'm going to be accessing very often. These are kind of, you set it once and forget it, with one exception. That would be the global input B. When we talk about virtual sound checks, that will come into play. This seems like a really odd location for that, but there it is. It's on the user preferences page of the menu. So we'll come back around and we'll talk about that later. One thing that you can set up are user layers. I'll show you that. I have a couple of different user layers set up. We'll come back around to that. That's a favorite feature of mine. I do get some options for the meters, both on the faders and the meters inside of the channel strip. I can set these independently. I can set them to either pre or post fader. That's a nice feature. I'm very much a fan of pre-fade meters, but there are instances where a post-fade meter would be nice. So I like being able to set those independently from one another. You also have a user, and it's called user defined. So actually what I figured out that does is there are 8 buttons down the far right side of the console over here. I can assign these to be several different things. And then if I assign one of the buttons to be flip, then I get another set of 8 buttons. So these could be mute groups, these could be shortcuts to on-screen elements, some things like that. I do find it odd that I have to lose one of my 8 buttons so that I can get to the next layer. I would love to have a dedicated flip button somewhere so that I don't have to eat up one of my 8 to make that happen. So that's kind of the user interface. We do have the 16 channel faders. We do have 4 layers of 16 faders. So This is a really unique thing about this console that I've not seen on any others. Obviously, I can hit input layer A, input layer B. That swaps out all 16 faders at a time. Alternatively, I can come up here to the user interface on the console and I can just drag left to right. I can scroll, and when I do this, you'll notice the buttons are now, I have 2 pink buttons instead of a single white button. So this tells me that I'm looking at a little bit of both of those layers. So what this does is, in this instance, probably can't read the text from the video, but I've got my drum mics, bass, my keyboards and guitars, my lead vocal, and then one of my BGV mics, my background mics, but I've got 2 more in addition, but they just happen to be mics 17, 18, 19. So I can't see them from this view. So it's awkward to go, you know, background vocal here, fader, flip, you know, a couple of backgrounds here. So with this, I am able to just kind of scoot over a couple of channels at a time. And now I have all of my background vocals right here together. That's a neat feature. I do like that. Again, this is one of those things that I mentioned before, that Windows 7 is not inherently made for touch interfaces. So while we do have this working, I'm effectively just, my finger is a mouse and a single click when I do this. So I can't sling this across and have them kind of scroll like we're used to seeing on iPads and tablets and phones and things. It's just not something that the operating system will support. So it's a little bit, feels a little bit clunky compared to what we're used to every day playing with our phones and stuff. Just an observation. We have 3 output layers, so bus A, bus B, and C. This console, this version of the console, the CDC6, does have 64 inputs and 48 bus outputs. So we get lots of outputs to play with. Each of the outputs can be configured as an aux, a group, or a matrix. And any of those aux, groups, or matrices can be configured as a stereo bus. Obviously, it eats up 2 of the buses, but then when I send things to them, to a stereo bus, I get a pan, so I can pan left and right inside of a stereo bus. Things like EQ and whatever can follow across the stereo pair as well. My next layer is the VCA layer. So I do have a dedicated button to jump right into the VCAs. I do like that. The way the VCAs work are pretty neat. We'll come back and take a look at that in a little bit. Graphic EQ for all of my output buses. Kind of typical. The faders become my 31 band EQ. Fader follow is a really neat way to mix 2 output buses. So it's effectively mixing on faders for your output bus, but the way they implement it, I think, is really, really slick. So we'll look at that in a little bit. I do have 4 master faders. They call this a control fader layer. So by default, I get my main left, center, right output bus. I have created a custom layer here, so my next fader over is the subwoofer bus. Next one over is my vocal instrument or vocal reverb return. So if my worship leader is doing a song, I've got some verb up on his vocal, and he, between songs, wants to do a prayer, I can just reach over and yank that down real fast, kill the reverb on his speaking, and then bring it right back up. I like having assignable faders over here. The far left one is pre-configured as the headphone volume. I've seen that before, but it's certainly not very common. There are 2 headphone jacks on the console. There's one on the face of the console down here, and also one at the far left side. It's nice having 2 of them. There is a rotary knob for volume control next to each of those jacks. The knob is a little bit fiddly to get to. You can reach it, but it was recommended to me to turn that all the way up and then just use the fader as your volume control. That's fine. It works. Again, I like having two headphone jacks right on the surface. We do have a numeric keypad here. I've yet to use it for anything. If we had a whole bunch of cues in a list, that would probably get used. A few scene recall and scene store settings here, and then obviously we have select buttons for our 4 assignable custom layer faders. So up here at the top of the console, not a whole lot else to see. There is a USB slot, so we can stick a USB stick in there and save console setup or do software updates. And there's the telltale blinking mute all button. When you boot the console up, normally, although I've had it not do this occasionally, the mute all button is blinking and you'll have meters everywhere and no sound. And you have to remember to come up here and turn off the mute all. It could be useful in certain situations, but is just an extra step for everybody to build into their muscle memory as they operate the console. So that's the main user interface.